Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and our guest today is Dr. Greg Jantz, author of Healing the Scars of Childhood Abuse, Moving Beyond the Past into a Healthy Future. Dr. Greg Jantz, welcome to the program.
It is very good to be with you. This is an important topic.
Well, thank you. It's important to me as well. Dr. Greg Jantz is a certified eating disorder specialist, certified chemical dependency counselor, a national certified psychologist, and a licensed mental health counselor. The author of 28 books, Dr. Jantz is the founder of the Center, a Place of Hope, listed as one of the top 10 facilities for treatment of depression in the United States. He brings a message of hope and healing to audiences through seminars, conferences, and the media. He has appeared on shows such as Dr. Phil, CNN, Fox, ABC, and NBC. You can find him at www.aplaceofhope.com/Jantz, HTM. Dr. Greg, healing the scars of childhood abuse. Is there anyone who is immune to some form of childhood abuse?
You know, we all have things that have happened to us. Some of them are more traumatic than others, and I look at it on a continuum. Part of growing up, you're going to deal with loss, you're going to deal with some maybe relationship struggles, but there's a line that gets crossed that I'll call it trauma, where there's things that have been done to you that are really in the abusive category. If you grew up in a home where there was screaming and yelling, and then there was physical hitting, maybe it was called discipline, but there's a line that was crossed, and usually it's a repeated pattern. And this really ends up to be what we call today abuse.
This is not new. The study and the science of it and the healing of it is what we would call the newer developing territories.
Sure. What do we do about it is probably the newer. And there's more of an honest awareness now of, okay, this is abuse. You see, for so long, we tended to normalize it and say, well, that's just the way so-and-so is, or that's just the way it is. So we've in a faulty way, we've normalized the behavior, or we've denied it, or we just rationalize it and we'll say, well, that's just the way he is. And we make it okay when it's not okay.
Is it how we perceive it that makes it abuse? How it's intended that makes it abuse? Is it a frequency, or is it degree of impact, which puts it in the abuse category?
Right. Well, here's what's important. People make mistakes. A parent could, out of anger, let's say, hit a kid or said some things that really crossed a line, and they felt guilty about it. They did all they could to seek forgiveness, and they had an awareness. Now, that's different than abuse, because all human beings will make mistakes. I'm a parent, and I've certainly had some regret and wish I hadn't said some things, but a healthy human being seeks forgiveness, and we change our behavior. With abuse, it's a pattern with a deliberate intent to have caused harm to another person. It's a deliberate attempt to not only cause harm, but to injure. And usually we're looking at power and control. I have more power or control over you. So that's how we look at abuse.
How prevalent is what you would categorize in the area of childhood abuse, whether or not it's emotional or physical?
Well, when we look at the topic, and this is a difficult one, but when we look at sexual abuse, the statistics right now are saying somewhere around 1 out of 3 girls will be a victim of sexual abuse by her 18th birthday. 1 out of 3. Now, just to think about that is, wow, 1 out of 3 girls. When we look to boys on sexual abuse, it's probably 1 out of 7. And so those numbers are really alarming. So that means a victim of sexual abuse prior to their 18th birthday. And so that's the sexual abuse. And if you were sexually abused, you're automatically emotionally abused. And, there's abuse that is emotional abuse where a person is belittled, they're demeaned, and that's all it is. It's verbal and emotional abuse. But then there's compounding abuse where if it's physical and then there's sexual and emotional. So abuse can be several layers.
When do we see the impact of abuse manifesting in someone's life?
Well, here's what's difficult. We all have to have a way of coping what was done to us. If it was never ever resolved, then maybe you grew up and as an adult, you've never had a good sense of self-esteem and who you are. You may have struggled with a lot of relationship issues. Or what's really common is we tend to move towards more addictive behavior, secretive drinking, secretive eating. We're looking for a way to self-medicate just this pain. If I can self-medicate and kind of keep that pain at bay, it doesn't work well, but it's kind of what I've learned to do.
In my own life, I've always looked at it and said my parents did the best they could with what they understood in the environment which they were raised in.
Yes.
They
Yes.
passed that on. It's the same answer I give for pastors in denominations that aren't preaching the gospel that
Yes.
comes from the gospel. They're only doing the best that they can do with
Right.
what it is that they were trained to do. So it's a justification, and certainly people have the sense to question or to ask, but in order to graduate, you have to answer the question correctly. And when you become conditioned, and it is seminary, college, upbringing is conditioning behaviors, thought processes, questions and answers, boxes being checked, you tend to revert back to, as your natural position or posture,
Sure.
to what it was that you were taught.
Right.
That brings up patterns, and we see repetitive patterns, which
Yes.
then become an indication that there's something stimulating the response, and
Right.
we need to look at that. But because the individual hardly ever goes and stands in front of the mirror and says, I've got an anger problem.
Right.
I've got a problem with narcissism. I've got a problem. We're very self-centered, self-ish, but not self-aware.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So the people in our lives are the reflectors of our emotional patterns and our emotional behaviors. How does one get to the point where we are able to identify that there are things in our lives, scars of childhood abuse or marital abuse or any kind of abuse? How do we get to the point where we are able to take that first step of the 12 of acknowledging that there's a problem?
Yeah, I think too that's difficult for many. If you lived in an environment of abuse and now I have to, you say part of healing is I have to really tell the truth and I have to acknowledge what happened to me. I did have a gal once who said to me, she said, Dr. Jantz, if I really do that, I will start crying and I will lose control and I will never, I'll lose it. I'll lose my mind. So there's the fear. There's the fear if I really tell the truth, if I'm really dealing with this, it's so horrible, it's so overwhelming that I can't manage it. And this is why there's times where we've got to have the right kind of help, the right kind of intervention, and the right safe setting to really begin to say, okay, here's what happened, and really to be cared for in that. We can learn a lot in the counseling process about dealing with reality, new tools to how am I going to deal with things, how to recreate healthy relationships in my life, probably I'm going to deal with forgiveness. Those are things that are key concepts I've got to deal with. But also, there's the work that God's got to do in our life. There's another level of healing that I believe, when there's been abuse, that is healing on the heart level, that I believe is a God job.
People define themselves as happy or unhappy. I look at circumstances, and people have a different category of expectation versus hope.
Yes.
I hope this person will do this, but then they didn't do it. Well, I kind of expected that. I have a 28-year-old daughter. I'm inclined to know before she makes a decision what decision she's going to make, but I hope and pray that she doesn't.
Yes.
But I don't become the disappointed person of someone who had an expectation that she was going to make the right decision. Now,
Right.
I become disappointed. I'm irritated, or I'm bothered, but I'm not consumed or fully engaged. In the process of parental relationships, in the process of how we were raised and how we raise,
Mm-hmm.
the Bible, of course, is the greatest tool of all for not exacerbating your children, and for children to honor their mothers and fathers, and those are all great words. But there's that 3-year-old that that you shouldn't leave a full cup on an expensive table without a lid on it, and you leave it there anyways, and the kid
Sure.
knocks it over, and you get angry with the child, but it was really your own fault. 40 years later, you look back on it, and you still feel like it's your own fault, and you're never going to be able to fix that. So you
Right.
have, and you have a discussion with the child, and the child remembers it too. So there's still a sting to it. How do you take the sting out of the shared, even the ones we acknowledge?
Mm-hmm. There is a sting, and we call those triggers or trigger points. I can be triggered. Sometimes I may see somebody and go, that looks like the guy that abused me, and everything comes back. We call that post-traumatic stress. You get triggered and you're reminded. And so that's the sting. Now, I do believe, as we accept the truth about ourselves, and we've really been empowered in forgiving ourselves, and potentially really working to forgive an abuser, that sting grows less. We need to be able to always honestly say, here's what happened to me, here's how I'm living my life today, and I'm really going to go back to God using things for good. I'm going to be restored. In fact, I'm going to be stronger. And that's healing, and that's recovery, when a person can come to that place. But you may have a situation where you even hear somebody and go, oh, that sounds like that person. And it's easy to go back and believe all the lies. And it's easy to be retriggered and go, oh yeah, I'm really nobody. And you start to feel bad about yourself again. Some people may go, yeah, that's right. I really deserve that. And we fall into that. So those are just the old lies coming back. So part of recovery is learning how to deal with old lies. And I'm calling them lies because it's not the truth. Because somebody demeaned you, abused you, hit you, shamed you, that doesn't mean that you're defective. That doesn't mean you're bad. That doesn't mean you're unlovable. That person that did that to you tells us more about them. It's not about you.
It's interesting that the news has been filled with stories of sexual sin, which has been normalized so much that we coined the phrase the casting couch. And you might not be aware, but that term, the casting couch, just celebrated its 80th birthday. as a reference to somebody equating an idiomatic term, a pictorial term. Everybody knows what it means. And we've allowed it to become a normalized phrase within our society, that this is an acceptable standard within an industry. And now all of a sudden there is a great deal of negativity being shown on it. What's your take on what we're seeing today in the exposure that this sexual sin, which goes back to young boys, young girls, goes back to people in positions of power? We had the Boy Scout affair, we had the Catholic Church big expose. There is abuse of power and control at the highest levels of corporations, of governments, of churches, of respectable places. Yes, it is a condition of fallen man. Yes, the Bible tells us this is going to exist.
Yes.
But when you talk about 1 out of every 3 girls before their 18th birthday will have experienced sexual abuse, that means that either only non-Christians commit sexual abuse. Statistically, if 71% of Americans are Christians, then statistically it's only non-Christians that commit sexual abuse. And we know that's not the case. We know that the incidence of sexual abuse is the same in the secular world as it is in the church. We know that sexual sin, we know that physical abuse, marital abuse, divorce, all of the statistics are equal whether or not you're a believer or not a believer. Yet we use in the recovery process faith, power of God, the restorative power of God, but we're already in this place where we, the same, it's almost like the same book I carry that I've used to spank you with is the same book that I'm going to carry to use to heal you with. Right. And I'm struggling with this and trying to understand this. Help me, please, doctor.
Sure. There are people who misuse Scripture, and we call that spiritual abuse, and it can still be about power and control. I think there's probably 2 types of that spiritual abuse. One that is sincerely delusioned, if you will. They're sincerely confused and really believing they're doing the right thing. And then there's the other who they know clearly that they're doing the wrong thing, and they're using that Scripture to excuse their behavior and to justify their behavior. And there'd be a spiritual abuser that may say, you know what, I'm being directed by God to do this, and so then you're arguing with God. I think it's important to know there are different motivations for abuse. There are people that grew up in a home where there was a lot of probably rage behavior, and so when you grew up, you just kind of did the same thing, and you're doing what you learned to do until you learn a better way, and you can learn a better way. So there's difficult to reconcile that the Scriptures are being used to both abuse me and to heal me. Well, it's probably not the Scriptures. It's the abuser misusing that because of the power and control that they're attempting to exert over you. That's important to differentiate between those two.
You say in your book that we tend to deny the truth of our own childhood abuse.
Yes.
We diminish it, or we flat out deny it.
Right.
In my particular case, as I look at a man who was my father, and I loved him as a father, there was a great age gap between us, 38 years
Okay.
age gap between us. By the time I was in my early teens, he was an old guy, because this is back in the 60s. So, being in your mid-60s today, we're young and vibrant. Being in your 60s 50 years ago, you're on your way to death.
Yeah.
Our whole paradigm has shifted. I was asked to preach my father's funeral.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't know exactly how to present, because we didn't have the relationship that I wanted. And so I had to come to reconcile with myself what mourning meant to me, because I did not mourn his death.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was the one who spoke to him on the phone and released him to die from hospice, and said, "It's okay, I'm here. I'll look over the family. I'll make sure that my mother's taken care of.
Yes.
Don't worry about it. You go ahead. Everything's okay." And listen to him take his last breath. When it came time for me to address mourning, I had to reconcile that I wasn't mourning the loss of my father. I was mourning the loss of ever having the opportunity to have the dad that played ball with his kid, or the dad that taught his kid a skill. And there wasn't a real emotional connection. It's over 20 years ago. There's still no emotional connection. But when I gave the eulogy was given as an address, a message from what I knew was in my father's heart that he was incapable of expressing.
Right.
A message to my mother, a message to my two sisters, and putting into what I knew was in his heart that he was incapable of expressing to me. Because he grew up in an environment, if you said that you were proud of your son, or that they did a good job, then you would expect them to slack off. You didn't come from, it was a military environment.
Yes.
You didn't give an accolade because, well, then I've accomplished it. I'm not going to drive towards more excellence. So I began to reframe my picture of him and my relationship with him to what he was trying to do, but he was incapable of doing. And I was able to find reconciliation that way. I don't have an emotional mourning for him, but I appreciate that I could not be the man I am today had he not been the man that he was as that father. I would not say that he abused me. Did he punish me or discipline me his way? He did. If I brought it to you and we described it, you would say yes, he did.
Right.
And I would say to you, he used the most effective means he knew, because he was not as educated as I was. He wasn't as smart as I was, and he resented that. It was a friction because of the age difference and his European upbringing. So there was a whole different, we came from two different worlds. But in relationships today, as we look at, and not just women, because we tend to look at depression and anxiety and some of these stresses as having to do because the frequency of women's sexual is higher, 4 or 5 times higher, maybe 7 times higher of childhood sexual abuse of a girl. Guys tend not to deal with it at all, but it still manifests itself in the way that they raise their children. How do we, and we only have another half hour, how do we put the idea into the head of people that it's okay that you didn't have the Ozzie and Harriet, the father knows best, you didn't have the perfect parents, but yet God chose those parents for a reason, and at some point in our adulthood, does it become our responsibility to become harvesters of the good, to look back and reap out of that field all that we want to hold on to that should shape our character, and free ourselves by saying, I reject, I don't accept it. You, as a matter of fact, you said I would grow up to be nothing, and you were right, because I grew up to be something. Okay? I didn't grow up to be nothing. I grew up to be something. So, so in that statement, you're right. Okay, I agree with you. I didn't become nobody. I became somebody.
Yes.
And so how do you do that? That takes an intellect. There's a certain intellect that can do that. But what do you do about that wounded, hurt person that's still wounded, still hurt, and is they're self-inflicted wounds, they're inflicting wounds on others, and the patterns are not able to be broken because they just, you cannot tell them that they're going through, that they're doing this. How do you get them to realize, is there, and I'm not talking about a trick or a tool, is there a dialogue that can be opened? Is there a way to frame and address some of these things that are going to bring an opening, and then when there's an opening, a way to start cleaning house?
And we've got to, first of all, be willing and I think ultimately brave enough, as you've described, to clean that house. And that takes a fair amount of courage to say, I'm going to live differently. I don't know for sure what that looks like, but I'm going to be willing to take those steps. I think it's so important, though, for us to have the right kind of assistance. You know, of course, in writing the book, Healing the Scars of Childhood Abuse, it's a start. We need new information. We also need a plan, and we need to know there's hope. And so with that in mind, I think about, okay, others have done this. Others have navigated this. I'm going to be willing to do it so as well. You know, and that's, you know, we put on the book, moving beyond the past into a healthy future. So I've got to make that decision. What's so important is my identity is not what was done to me. My identity was not what was said to me. My identity was not how I was lied to or abused. And so often we take that on. I don't feel like I'm anybody. I take it on as though I don't have any value, and I've lost my value. And that's not true. You have great value. God still has a plan for your life, and we can redeem that plan, and it's going to be good. My goodness, you can do this. And so I think we've got to come to that place of saying, okay, I'm at the top of the high dive, okay, and you tell me there's water down below. Okay, I'm going to jump, and that's a decision you have to make. I'm going to do this. Otherwise, you see, abuse, what keeps abuse going in our lives is fear. So it's the fear. And fear paralyzes us. So we're going to be brave and courageous, right?
In a relationship, and I've seen it many times, we tend to say that so-and-so married his mother, or so-and-so married their father.
Yeah.
They're drawn to certain attributes, but these are packages, not just attributes. I mean, you know, he's gregarious and he's wonderful and he's a joker and he's this, but he also has this, but my dad was like that, and, you know, I survived all that. But you get to a crossroads where it becomes destructive, self-destructive, and we look at things like passive-aggressive behavior. We look at narcissism. We look at control. We look at habitual lying.
Yep.
We look at a lack of candor and honesty, but yet they'll still go to church on Sundays. They'll still go to Bible study. Yeah. There is this conflict, and I guess it's a conflict by design. God created us this way, that there was a war, that when we opened ourselves to receive the Holy Spirit, it wasn't an exchange for the evil that we were born with, for the sin nature. It was to counter, to conquer that sin nature. But
Right.
that battle itself is warring in all of us.
Yeah.
In Paul's statement,
Yeah.
I do what I shouldn't do,
Yep.
and what I should do, I don't.
Right.
If there's somebody right now who is looking back at their childhood, and with the holidays coming up, and they're
Yes.
thinking, I don't want to go because my dad's going to be there, or my father, or my stepmother, or my sister, my unreconciled, my mirror, the one that's going to reflect back to me that we have issues. What advice would you give them as to how to prepare themselves to not avoid it,
Sure.
but to go into it equipped for success?
And this is a very real situation I think many will face. When there's active abuse, I don't think we go into those situations, but we don't ever go into those situations alone. So you've got to have a key person with you that's your safety buffer. Maybe it's a spouse, but you've got to go, don't go alone, and don't ever allow yourself to be alone with the abuser. So I think what's important is also you're going to have safety in another person, but you're not going to purposely engage in a conversation at any kind of a length at a Christmas function or at a family function with a person that has mistreated you or abused you in the past. So don't go alone, have a buffer with you, and then have an understanding if if things are getting intense and you're concerned and you're not doing well, you need to have ahead of time a code or a system of communicating to that safe person that's with you that you need to step away. And so it could be a wink, it could be a touch on the side, but have a communication that says I need to kind of remove myself. And so you've got to be willing to remove yourself when it begins to be overwhelming. And you also need to go into those situations really fortified in a sense that whatever this person says, I'm not going to personalize it. It's not about me. So this is not the time to engage in a fight or a debate or let anger consume you where you're leashing out as well. And if you feel like I can't do that, then this may not be the right time to go to one of these situations.
It makes sense. It makes sense. Scripture talks about iron sharpens iron.
Yes.
We're called to a ministry of reconciliation. If we bring our gift to the altar and thereby realize somebody's holding something against us, we should leave our gift and go be reconciled. But doesn't reconciliation start from within?
Yeah, it does. It starts from within and within a willingness to be, and so there's an internal reconciliation. I've mentioned forgiveness because sometimes we've got to forgive ourselves. Maybe some things happen to you and you feel like, oh man, I wasted all these years. I drank, I was in various addictions and unhealthy relationships, and you really are harboring a lot of resentment towards yourself. One of the steps to healing is I've got to forgive and release myself so that I'm capable of really forgiving others. So that forgiveness is not only to those that abused me, but it's also forgiveness myself. And then thirdly, there is a forgiveness of receiving from God. And I don't mean to make that all sound real simple, but those are things we have to work through.
Many people have scars as reminders on their body of either old surgeries or old injuries or I have a 50-something-year-old scar on my thumb
Yes.
that if I ever look at it, reminds me of the day that I was working at the candle factory and I stuck my hand behind a shelf and I got cut by a piece of glass. Okay, I don't ever think about it, and if I press on it, it doesn't hurt because it
Yeah.
healed a long time ago. It's just a leftover remnant. But there are parts of ourselves that when we come face to face with the situation that we have a scar from, and that same situation still hurts, would that not be an indication that maybe externally we've been healed, but internally there's that infection that still exists, and we're going to have to reopen and cleanse and allow it to heal properly? And that's a tough process and requires counseling. Is this something you recommend people do on their own?
No, I think we've got to probably have the right type of person or situation to help us. And that's somebody that not only that we can trust and that's safe, but we want to tell our story to those that can help us. It's not about, if you will, it's not about bleeding out to everyone. We need to be selective about, I'm going to share this with, I'm going to work with this person who can really help me, who's equipped to help me. So that's an important piece. Be careful about who we share, but I think there's times where we really need the insights, we need the wisdom, we need a new way of looking at things, we need some new skills to practice. If I've been abused, I may not know, maybe it's sexually abused, even what is a healthy relationship. And I need to really work on what that is. I just see that so important to do that with somebody who really is qualified to help us.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I went through a marital betrayal that wound up costing me a congregation. And I went to a counselor who specialized in counseling for pastors.
Yes.
He was a pastor himself, and he was a trained psychologist, and he knew that pastors had unique circumstances. We were a people that were had a sense that we were alone, or that we couldn't have close relationships. There were things that went with the pastorate that are unique to the pastorate, betrayal being one of them in that realm. And so I spent time with him because he was perfectly equipped. It's not something I would talk to the person, sitting on a stool next to me about, because these were biblical principles and biblical healing and how to reconcile and how to move on with your life when something devastating has happened to you. In your estimation, how many adults are today walking around bearing scars of childhood abuse that are unhealed?
Wow. I think it's more than what we've ever imagined. And that's part of what prompted the writing of this book. I had written a book a number of years ago on healing the scars of emotional abuse. And I was surprised at the number of folks who say, you know what, I wasn't physically abused or sexually abused, but boy, emotional abuse, I really resonate with that. And I just see such great numbers. And we live in a culture where, addiction's happening earlier. And the sexualization is happening earlier. And so there's more opportunity for addiction. There's more opportunity for abuse than ever before. With that in mind, I think the numbers are unfortunately growing. And the people that many times will remain silent. It's like, again, we rationalize, we deny, and we try to normalize it, but we're silent for years. It's not uncommon for a person to, it's 20 years before they really told the truth about what happened to them. That's not uncommon.
Is it true that there needs to be reconciliation with the abuser?
That's maybe partially true, and what I mean by that is there's sometimes you cannot have that reconciliation. They're not accepting anything to do with what they've done, and they're perpetuating that pattern. It's continuing. So they're not a safe person. So you're not going to be in relationship with them. Now, there's others that we can go to, done right, where maybe they're confronted and they own up to it and they have remorse and they seek forgiveness, and you begin a restoration plan. But it's not instant. You're not going to instantly trust this person who abused you, but they've admitted to the wrongdoing, and there's a restoration process. Obviously, those are the encouraging ones, but there's times where nope, they're still an abuser, they're still active, they're not safe to have a relationship with.
And I think that's an important point to make. A lot of people find that they've confused forgiveness with reconciliation.
Yes.
A continual relationship with the person because I've forgiven them. I've forgiven a lot of people that I would prefer never, ever, ever to cross paths with again.
Yeah.
I actually like the passage of Scripture that says, feed your enemy, and it's like God heaping coals on their head.
Yeah.
And so I always picture me having lunch with them.
Yeah.
Maybe that's my little negative, twisted, biblical, cynical personality.
Helps you put it in perspective, though.
But early on, I would put my head on the pillow, and I was instructed that part of my therapy is that I had to pray for those that used me. So my prayer was simply, Lord, please bless that sorry sucker if you can.
Yeah.
That's how I started that healing process. You have a contemporary who Dr. John Trent, who talks about small changes in the heart through his book Heart Shift.
Yes.
And it's just the little change, not the big change. Now, the big changes are hard to maintain. It's the little, tiny change, that one thing to change. And I've done that. And I found it to be very effective. What I found in your book, which was very compelling, was that at the end of the book you have a section called Finding Truth. What's your message there for people who have been abused?
Finding truth is the empowering point. The truth about myself, the truth about my abuser, dealing with truth. Boy, when I deal with what's true, and I can be empowered. And so we're going to deal with truth. Now, there's another truth. It's the truth of God's word. It applies to me. I'm going to let that, if you will, soak in, penetrate my life and my heart. So I'm going to live by a new truth, the truth. So often I've adopted lies that my abuser said I was worthless, and so my whole life I've believed the lie that I'm worthless, and now I'm going to put the right truth in there. I'm going to live with the truth. And again, some of these things sound simple, but I'm going to practice these, and I'm going to practice them, and I'm going to have the right kind of help. And I do believe that you're going to see steady, progressive change when we decide to live with what the real truth is.
If we don't deal with the truth, there is no healing.
Correct.
There's just a false sense of healing.
Yes.
It's a hiding, it's a masquerade, it's a cover-up. But you maintain that you really can be healed from these childhood scars.
I really believe it. I've seen it, and I celebrate it.
In an active parenting situation where one or the other parent exhibits the behavior and they come to a point where they agree that one of them needs help.
Yes.
Where do they begin? What are some of the resources? Would they go to your website, aplaceofhope.com, and start a dialogue and get a referral? Would they where would you find strong, and I would only put them in the realm of Christian
Yes,
counseling
yes.
because everything else is man-made. How would one go about, what would be the steps somebody should take if they think they have an issue with past childhood abuse or even current abuse?
Well, I think we're going to make a decision. Today, I'm going to reach out. And so that may mean reaching out. Fortunately, we've been around for 30 years and we've got relationships and contacts all over, and we're a good resource for directing people. Maybe I'm going to make a decision today. I'm going to read some new material, and then I'm going to reach out. And you go, well, maybe a person may say, well, I've already tried that counseling thing. It didn't work. I'm going to say, in the right hands, with God's blessing, it will work for you. I've just seen it, and I want to say today also, be encouraged. There is healing. Be encouraged. And I couldn't say that if after 30 years I haven't seen people's lives really not only redeemed, but they're living a different life. And I want to say that is possible. You have a future and a hope.
I've heard in the term narcissist more in the last 10 years than I've heard it in the sum of my 66.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a new psychological coined diagnosis or phrase, but is narcissism a system of protection for victims of abuse?
Not only is it a system of protection, but it's a system of really ultimately denying what's happened. I can be narcissistic, and then I tend to blame others. I've seen situations where a person says, "Oh no, you asked for that, don't you remember? That was your fault." Or, you kept dressing that way and you were inviting this. And so they're going to defer it and they're going to blame. So we're going to watch for that. You'll never ever get well if you live with blame.
So for somebody that's dealing with somebody in their life that is narcissistic, that fits that classic, it's always somebody else, it's never me.
Exactly.
It's the ultimate victim role, and unless you say the right things, if you don't say the right thing, you're told what you should have said. And if you would have said that, you would have been told that that was wrong and there was something else. It's that moving target kind of relationship. How do you navigate that? How do you get help for somebody who exhibits that behavior? Because I've seen it more and more in the last, and you're in the practice, you're in the business, and you're shaking your head in agreement, saying, yeah, you've seen it more and more too. It seems to be the would it be the psychosis du jour?
That's good. That's good. A narcissist, or a person with these personality traits, first of all, they're unfortunately probably some of the last to get help, because there's the belief I don't need help because I'm right. So it's hard to help somebody who believes they're right. Here's the thing. Until we're humbled, until we're willing to be teachable, we're not going to be a good candidate for getting help. So a lot of times a narcissist or a person like that, or they need to probably lose things they really value. It's not until they've had significant loss that they're motivated to make any changes or to even look at anything. So usually there's a pretty significant crash in their life before they're willing to do anything about it. And sometimes it goes on for a long time, unfortunately. But they'll leave a wave of destructive relationships and a whole trail of hurt and pain behind them.
You make a very, very strong case. I've become a believer over the years that the harder you hit, the higher you bounce. But then there's that point where you hit so hard that you just shatter.
Yeah.
and you've got to find a way to keep it together through that process. Dr. Gregory Jantz, PhD, author of Healing the Scars of Childhood Abuse, Moving Beyond the Past into a Healthy Future. Find great help at aplaceofhope.com. An extraordinary resource, a blessing, someone who has a very practical understanding of the scriptures, as well as the frequency and the enormity of this problem and how many lives have been impacted from it. These are the walking wounded, and most oftentimes it's under friendly fire.
Yes.
And truth be known that most of these situations, the person who inflicted the pain was not intending to do it. It was a natural byproduct of their upbringing, their
Yes.
training, or their value system. And we have to unwind all of that and unknot it all in order to separate those strands out to find out which ones are yours, which ones are theirs, give them theirs back, hold on to our own, and define our and a clear healing. Dr. Jantz, thank you so much for being with us here. I hope you would be a regular guest. We would love to spend more time talking with you.
Thank you.
So many families need what you are offering. This book, Healing the Scars of Childhood Abuse, also author of several other books that I strongly recommend if you're looking for help in these areas. This is a starting point. This is not the answer book. This is a beginning point for you to evaluate and some things you can do on your own. Because if you find some small successes, you'll be encouraged to grab a hold of those larger ones. Dr. Gregory Jantz, thank you again so much for being with us. We wish you and your family a very happy and healthy Christmas and a very happy New Year and prosperity to all of you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Very good to be with you today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. God bless. And that brings to an end our live broadcasting day, but that doesn't mean we go off the air. We'll rebroadcast these segments and all of today's prior segments all day long, and then tomorrow you'll find them up on WND-TV and our YouTube channel. We hope you'll continue to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as all of our other offerings through our website at www.ianbn.com. Until we see you back here on Monday morning for our regular broadcast week to begin, we close out this day by wishing you a Shabbat Shalom and a great week, a Shavua Tov. Until we see you next week, we say Shalom.